So it's my great pleasure to continue to reinforce the importance of Kurt Lewin's thinking and work around the importance of group, understanding groups, group dynamics, group development, and so on. And so the two presenters who have been kind enough to share the benefits of their long experience and expertise are with us today, both emeritus members of NTL, Pat Bidol Padva and Barbara Bunker. And each of them are going to take a different approach to talking about their experience with groups. So we're going to start with Pat, and then we're going to have an opportunity to hear from Barbara. And while they're speaking, if you're aware of questions that come up in you, please note them, because we're going to hold our questions to the end. Because Barbara and Pat have decided to do tag team question answering. So that's the way we'll manage that. So keep track if you have something and make sure it doesn't get lost. So let me start with Pat. It's been so wonderful to spend time with Pat on this planning team, because Pat has been a relentless advocate for the power of groups and group behavior and the kind of expertise and understanding she developed as a graduate student at the University of Michigan working with Ron Lippitt. Of course, then that's one of the things she's going to tell us some stories about today. So Pat has had a long and distinguished career as an OD consultant. She consults to organizations all over the world in some of the most complicated situations you can imagine, involving intergroup, multi-party conflict resolution, the kind of stuff that typically makes our eyes cross. But Pat takes it on willfully and cheerfully and successfully. So at any rate, she has lots to tell us about how she became so clear about the value and importance and key dimension of group behavior and group process as a molecule for learning and change, working with Ron. So Pat, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm delighted to share my thoughts and perspectives with each of you. I was asked by the committee to talk about Ron Lippitt. I want to start with my connection with Ron Lippitt. I'm 81. So in the early 1970s, I was the executive director of an organization called New Perspectives in Race in Detroit. It was created after the 1967 race rebellions. And our mission was to look at the elimination of white racism at a systemic level in schools and communities in Detroit. And we also very quickly became known and were asked to move to places like Brownsville and in the New York area with Preston Wilcox and others. So on my board was Dr. Reginald Wilson and Dr. Orion Warden. Dr. Orion Warden was an early member of NTL. Dr. Reginald Wilson was connected, knew Ron Lippitt well, and he had been a Tuskegee Airman pilot. So he kept saying, if you want to be better, you got to step out and do the unexpected. So they both told me that they wanted me to go and get into Ron Lippitt's doctoral program. Now, they said their excuse was the fact that we weren't getting federal grants with my signature, even though I was the head person in the office. They had to sign because the federal government was requiring PhD signatures. So that was their reason. I think the real reason was they wanted me to get to work with Ron and to understand group dynamics and action learning and how to do democratic processes to make change. So I lived in the Detroit area. I was working with New Detroit. I had 2 young children, and I had to drive from Detroit area to Ann Arbor to the University of Michigan. So I thought, okay, this is going to be a drag, but I'll do it. It was a delight, folks. Absolute delight. Because what did I discover? Ron Lippitt ran his seminars that included doctoral students, master's students, and anybody else that wanted to come using the laboratory method. And we ended up getting such deep insights. And he also, for our doctoral students, gave us personalized advice on who else to study with. So I was sent off to study with Cartwright and Zander. Immediately, that deepened my understanding of group dynamics again. And of course, we had people on the faculty like I'm trying to read and see, so I don't forget, we had Renee Lickert, and scholars came to stay with us several times, like Carl Rogers. The other thing that Ron did was he told each of us, grad students and doctoral students, that if we really want to be good change agents, we also had to use a variety of approaches with our laboratory education. So we would be shipped off to the humanistic psychology conferences of Gene Houston, or to in-depth personal workshops with Carl Rogers. So how do you do street guerrilla intervention? So how do you have your clients do street guerrilla plays when you're working with them? And it was a fascinating journey, folks. And it didn't end when my doctorate was over, because he continued to mentor me and give me coaching. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about his approach. What I'm going to say about what Ron did are from two major written sources, and I'm getting one to show you. This one is called The Laboratory Method of Changing and Learning, and it was edited by Ken Benny and Bradford and Gibb and Ron Lippitt. It was published in 1975. I keep recommending it, and every time I do, folks will come back and say, but we can't obtain it. I hope you can. It is like the Bible, how you use laboratory education for changing and learning. And in it, a lot of what I'm saying is repeated in this book. I guess I'm saying that because some of what I'm going to say goes contrary to what we think was done with the laboratory education, and I want you to know I'm not making shit up. It's really based on data. The other book, if you really want to know more in depth about what Ron Lippitt did about futuring, his son, Dr. Larry Lippitt, has written a fantastic book. It was published in 1998, and it was Preferred Futuring. Envision the future you want and unleash the energy to get there. And it is not only a wonderful way of looking at what he's doing, but it also shows the original thinking that Ron had around futuring, and it tells some personal stories. So let's get at another piece of it. Who was Ron Lippitt? Well, he was born in 1914 and he died in 1986. He was a doctoral student himself of Kurt Lewin at Iowa, and he was influenced by that process to do a dissertation on leadership. And it was very important to him, not only his dissertation, but how he combined those learnings with laboratory education. The dissertation was on what works and what are the characteristics of democratic leadership, autocratic leadership, and laissez-faire. And in our seminars, which were run in the laboratory method, we often had spontaneous role plays of these different leadership styles. We would be assigned in subgroups to come back and address a situation. And they really did help get the point home of why that was very, very important. Ron also was deeply committed to education. He was deeply committed to social service. He studied with Piaget. He worked with Margaret Mead. He was an innovator. He was a pioneer. He's described as a pioneer at the University of Michigan's Institute of Applied Behavioral Science. When he died, they wrote that he was a pioneer in the development of experimental social psychology. He was renowned for his classic work on the effects of democratic, autocratic, and laissez-faire leadership of small groups, and for his later work on planned social change and then preferred futuring. So this is what his colleagues said about him at his memorial service. We all heard the story, the wonderful story of Kurt Lewin's insights and how Kurt Lewin had folks work with him. Dr. Marianne Rainey on Wednesday night explained the great depth of the first meeting that was held in Connecticut. And so Ron Lippitt was part of that. He also, because of Lewin's untimely death, NTL, its first variation, and we've had many different names and slightly different variations, but Ron Lippitt was a co-founder of NTL with Lee Bradford, Ken Benny, and one of the things he would say in our seminars when he talked about that, and he didn't talk about it a lot, was, I like what we did. I like what we learned from Kurt Lewin, but we were all white males. And that was one of our major flaws. So he would acknowledge that in our seminars. It's interesting that by 1967, NTL, still led by white males, but it had centers for, these were all the official centers of NTL in 1967, for community affairs, for educational programs, for international work, for organizational development, and Black affairs. So those were the official centers of work for NTL in 1967. And if John Carter was speaking, he could give more details about how that happened, because he and I talked about that. Ron Lippitt also, because he was with the group that we're talking about, was one of the founders of the T group. And by 1964, he was convinced that the T group was an important change modality, but that if all we did was the T group, which in his mind and the other founders' mind was to help individuals understand group formation, their impact on groups, and to give them the democratic skills to go back home and jointly create democratic situations in whatever they were engaged in. So that he was perceiving that it was democracy, democratic training, and you'll find that throughout the book that was written on community change, on laboratory change. Once Lewin died, and I'm sure Barbara Bunker will share us more aptly, but the whole MIT story, then Ron Lippitt worked, he was part of that, but he wasn't a main founder, but he did help co-found the University of Michigan Center for Research on the Utilization of Scientific Knowledge. And that was where most of our seminars were held. And if you know anything about the professors I named, they were leaders in the field of group dynamics based on scientific evidence. What does that mean? Based on data, acknowledge opinions, but only follow data. We must not go by our opinions. We must be based on qualitative data, as G. Newman so beautifully shared with us. And Larry Lippitt's book, he tells the story of how by the late 50s and the early 60s, moving into the 70s, Ron Lippitt decided that futuring was the way to go. And he would have all kinds of sessions with us graduate students in our evening seminars with them, brainstorming and okay, what are the pros and cons of the traditional way of looking at problem solving with the laboratory education, and then moving to a futuring stance. How do we do it? Ad nauseum. I mean, we just went round and round on that with lots of debates. At the same time, we were beginning to work with him on what was called the Ypsilanti work. Ypsilanti is a small town near Ann Arbor in Michigan, University of Michigan. The main campus is Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Ypsilanti was a community of people of diverse community. It had a very active conflict going on. A white principal who was advocating full empowerment and social justice was tarred and feathered and left by the side of the road. So when we dealt with Ypsilanti and the school systems and at the community level, it was a full system intervention and how to have a joint future based on some real life challenges. And the challenge was not just social justice, it was also economic justice and other aspects. But as he moved into futuring, he became more and more convinced that we really have to think of the group as the change unit. It could be interpersonal, it could be in a T group, it could be team building, it could be division, interdivisional, interorganizational, interfacing with community. It could be global, but it had to be system level. And Larry Lippitt's book really gives you in detail how he thought that could be done. When he retired, Ron Lippitt created a nonprofit called Human Resources Development Associates. And he would have himself and a few others of us in the area work with him on providing shared community planning of futures for dozens and dozens of cities in the United States and Canada particularly. He also did a lot of work in Japan. He worked extensively with the Japanese YMCA. And I had the honor of being with him several times when they would come to his home in Ann Arbor, and we would sit in the kitchen. He had a beautiful 3-story house. We would sit in the kitchen talking about what they were doing, and he would be there with 2 or 3 of us and the people from Japan. So what is this laboratory education? Well, it began in the work in Connecticut with Kurt Lewin and Ron Lippitt and Ken Benny and Leland Bradford. It was group dynamics research that very quickly translated into our current version of T groups and laboratory education. By 1947, unfortunately, Kurt Lewin had died, but the other men were holding T groups in Bethel, our isolated place to be together. I love Bethel, by the way. And the goal was, as you would find if you can get hold of the laboratory method of changing and learning, the really goal in their mind was to have group membership and leadership that could affect social change when the participants went back home. We've had many things happen in thought processes within NTL and by folks, applied behavioral scientists outside of NTL. So we have appreciative inquiry, we have dialogical D, we have a variety of modalities that are being used. The goal of all of these is to use laboratory education to provide thinking and the skills needed to integrate personal learnings, we now perhaps in NTL call it use of self, and jointly engage in planned action for social improvement. By the way, Ron used the term change agent. He thought expert consultants that went in and owned the process and didn't engage all the impacted stakeholders were he never used this term. I'm going to use an impolite term, folks. The term we would use in our seminars is they would be mind fucking their participants. In other words, I'm the great big expert, you follow me and you're going to get success. And then the projects wouldn't get implemented, nor would there be success. Excuse my language, folks. The targets of change, Lennox is laughing because we're once a week, the organization development hub within NTL meets. And I sometimes slide into saltier language. I got that from being an activist, starting way back when I was a teenager. The whole goal also was to create learning communities, each of these types of interventions that uses lab experience. So these were not workshops that we were holding. These were laboratories where the activities of the participants were creating how they were going to address the what. So the what in a T group would be to learn my impact on groups impact on me and their formation and some feedback on me. That's the task. The process would be, and how did that happen? If we do not pay attention to process, the content is almost irrelevant because it doesn't get done. So I want to say a few more words about laboratory education. This is not just Ron Lippitt, it's all the founders and people that came after him, like Mickey Rickfo and Donald Klein and others that I got to work with, Edie Seashore. But the first component that's essential is that laboratory education, whether it's done for future searching at a complex system level or in a T group or in a team building session, has to have participation, involvement, and experience-based interactions that are focused on the here and now, and both the doing, the what, and the processing what happened. Whatever the level is, no matter how small, there's always systems implications. So it really has to view the person in light of the environment and the organization, the system in which they're engaged. The collaborative is don't tell folks what to do, work in partnership jointly. Ron would say no change can occur with one person that's meaningful. And make sure that you use the best of consensus-based decision-making. And it should be humanistic. It's very optimistic. No matter how bad it is, we can work to make the world a better place for people and the environment and the health. But back then we were saying for people. The environment, in this case, I was talking about our physical environment. And it must be data-based, not opinion-based. We can share opinions, but they have to be labeled as opinions. What are the actual qualitative data in this situation that needs to be addressed? How do we do it with humble inquiry? And how do we use all the best techniques to do that? Now, I'd like to conclude my speaking. I promised you, Peter, it'd be less than 30 minutes. No, I think I'm honoring you. I'm honoring you. What would Ron Whippet or Kurt Lewin say about what NTL should do for our preferred futuring? So, and organizations beyond NTL, because we're not the end of the world, we're just one organization. First of all, I think he would say, acknowledge that change for all entities is continuous, chaotic, and impacts the entire system, and that there's independency across the different systems. Jointly envision desired future and unleash the passion and energy to achieve positive outcomes, including, this is important, primary and secondary impacts. So you have to gather data. You had a great change effort, but the impact was lousy. Jean gave us some wonderful examples of that in her talk. It's really essential. We do not pay enough attention to what are we going to do and what are the potential impacts. And I also think that the type of mentoring and coaching he did, I mean, after I got my doctorate, he continued to work on me as I developed a graduate student program and practice with hundreds of organizations on consensus-based mediation of public, complex, multi-party, and multi-issue disputes. And we're talking about big deal disputes, folks, and it works beautifully. One of my large-scale interventions was on what's going to happen with the Kissimmee River in Florida. And we had about 52 parties at the table. We did a lot of fishbowl, small group word dialogues, data gathering. And the condition was because they had this Yankee female PhD come down, which was me. I mean, they were desperate. They were just, in the middle of all kinds of lawsuits. And they were looking at the environmental, they were looking at the impact on the communities, they were looking at the economic. They had to be looking at lots of issues. Lots of the stakeholders were federal, state, and local agencies. We had fishermen, we had cattlemen, we had all kinds of environmentalists that were at the table. And the condition of my work with them was, I'm going to have you do something called laboratory education. When I first met with them, you're going to be working a lot in subgroups and large groups. The only active thing I will do if I find out that any of you are doing dirty politicking behind the scenes, I will tell everybody on you. And we went off. And any meeting that you all decide you don't want me, just vote and I'm gone, and I thank you for being here. So those were my conditions. We worked together. We developed a wonderful plan that's the only part of the Everglades restoration system to this day that's being implemented fully. And the Okeechobee ranchers and cattlemen and agriculturalist who ran the city of Okeechobee, that's right next. The Kissimmee River goes down into Lake Okeechobee, and it's right at that interface, had me come after the mediation after the 3 years and teach all the community leaders in Okeechobee how to do fish bowls. So to this day, this little influential stakeholders of agriculturalists, somehow they have fish bowls. It's probably like new NTL members that are saying that, how did we get this into our system? But they're still doing, I checked last night, they're still doing fish bowls. He certainly did a lot of work with Kathy Dannemiller on her full-scale change in Ford. And he worked, of course, continued to work with Larry Lippitz. I want to say one more thing about what I think he would say about some of our current realities, which is not only does he think democracy needs to be taught and learned using cooperative action, research, and inquiry to assess the impact of change approaches in a manner that promotes the joint creation of wise and equitable outcomes. But he also, I think, would say that we really need to rethink how we are defining diversity and cohorts and different types of social identity situations to really reflect global realities, the newer knowledge about these things, and to increase dialogue on competing cross-cultural forces at all levels of the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. That was terrific. And it, I think, is another real opportunity to think about how we can continue to, quote unquote, live our legacy by being aware of and conscious of and appreciative of some of the key principles that were articulated apparently some good time ago and are still as relevant today and in the future as they were then. And I think that is one of the real benefits of having the kind of legacy that sustains NTL now as a 75-year-old organization. All right, thank you, Pat. We're now going to move on to another colleague, an NTL colleague who herself has a most distinguished history. She's the Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of Buffalo. Many of you know her well as our Barbara, and she is in fact Barbara Bunker, who we were delighted was willing to join us for this conversation on groups, because when it comes to certainly understanding the way in which structure determines behavior, particularly in large systems change, Barbara's one of the, I think, foremost experts in that. She got her PhD at Columbia under Mort Deutsch, who in fact was a student of Kurt Lewin's at the University of Michigan, and then she went on to have a distinguished career as a professor herself of psychology and as a leading and influential consultant and as a member of NTL for many years. And she cut her teeth at Bethel, learned about T groups at Bethel, as many folks did, and grew to really understand and appreciate the value of laboratory learning and T group experience through her own sort of visceral experience. And she's here to tell us stories about that, how she and her colleague Billy Alban came to sort of think carefully about how to document and present information about large systems change and bring that to our attention and make sure that it was very much embedded in our understanding about the value of the group, which again is an opportunity to continue understanding and appreciating the complexity of group dynamics at all levels of system. So with that in mind, Barbara, welcome, and we'll be delighted to hear what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Good. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm overwhelmed with concepts. I need a break. Ed Schein was wonderful this morning. The speakers this morning were, Gene Newman was wonderful. My previous friend here was wonderful. But I don't know, I think I'm just going to talk about myself personally a little bit first, because I just need to get rid of all this stuff that's in my head, basically. First, I should tell you a few things about me and where I am. I'm 91 years old. I'm totally retired. And I've decided there's a whole new era of life, and it's called being old and not working anymore. And so this is the first thing in 5 or 6 years that I've done that's at all conceptual. And it's been fun to think about, but it's also, I'm using this period of my life to do things I've never done before, to explore things that I haven't had time to do because I was so damn busy writing for tenure, running around the world and doing seminars and helping organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So I can talk about that later if you want to, but we should all start thinking about the fact that the work world is not the end of the world, basically. Anyway, that's just a personal kind of note. I have to talk about myself as a person because I started not knowing what on earth was going on. And I went through college and then I went to the University of Chicago. I got a divinity degree because I was interested in religion. And then I worked at Duke during the sit-in era. So I was taking Black and white students from Duke and North Carolina College all over the South to conferences. That was the era when the YM and YW were big on campus. I was in charge of the YWCA at Duke for the Women's College. We put 300 women in social agencies every week as volunteers. We went to interracial conferences. The Greensboro sit-ins happened while I was working there, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of activity. When I got there, leadership training involved giving courses in Robert's Rules of Order. And I did not know what the hell to do. In other words, I didn't know what the alternatives were. And then in the summer of 1958, the YM and YW sponsored at Estes Park a laboratory education course run by two people trained by the Episcopal Church. And if you will remember, the Episcopal Church was very big into T groups, et cetera, at that point in time. And I was shipped off to a T group lab, which changed my life. I thought, oh my Lord, look, there's all this dynamics, I was fascinated. And I was terribly lucky because I was in with a fairly young group of people. And many of the people who attended this workshop were people who'd known each other for years in this context. And their groups did not go well because we later got very clear, you don't do T groups in organizations with people who work with each other. And these people were in that setting, basically. So, but I was lucky because I was with a group of newcomers and we had a marvelous time. And I went back to my campus and the only thing I could think about was, I got to get to Bethel. So in 1962, I got to Bethel. I was in an advanced lab with Charlie Seashore. And that was a kick. I mean, that changed my life also. But one of the things that happened there was that some of those things, there were a lot of tensions at Bethel. And one of the things I got clear about was the whole business of gender, because I was raised with, just sort of not knowing who I was and what I was going to do. I didn't happen to get married as a 20-year-old or a 16-year-old. And so what was I going to do with myself? And so I fell into one thing after another. And when I got to NTL, I complained. I've been working for 8 years at Duke. I was paid $6,000 a year. I was working morning, night, and noon. And the dean of the college, who was a charming Milton scholar, used to say to me, Barbara, you weren't in your office on Saturday morning. I missed you. And I had been working 6 nights the week before, and I just was pissed off that people would treat me this way. And I had 2 very close women friends. And this is where I began to get into all kinds of issues of gender and how women are treated. And they sat me down once and they said, Barbara, we're tired of hearing you bitch and complain about how poorly you're paid and how hard you're working. You need a PhD, they said. And I was shocked. right down to my toes. It never occurred to me. I was not raised in a culture where women got PhDs. And so it took me a while to sort of come around. But eventually I did come around and I decided, well, this group stuff is wonderful and it's happening in academia. So maybe I do need to get a PhD. So then I started applying. I applied to Boston. I applied to the Ken Benny and Company. I applied to NYU and I applied to Teachers College Columbia, which is where all the applied psych is in Columbia. And Mort Deutsch was the head there. And they said they would be glad to have me. And I was glad to go, basically. And it turned out that Matt Miles, who hasn't been mentioned very much, but who was working with Ron Lippitt on some of the earliest interventions into school systems, was doing these wonderful projects. And I got to be part of that. I went out and collected data in Pittsburgh and different places in Westchester County. We fed back the data. I learned that whole process of survey feedback. In addition, I was running subjects in the lab in conflict resolution. So it was it was a very stimulating kind of environment. And Deutsch, one of the things that Ed Schein talked about was how Kurt Lewin was always talking about relevant kind of things. And that was a light bulb for me when I heard Ed talk about that, because Mort Deutsch used to go with us to the Interchurch Center across Broadway to eat lunch. They had a big cafeteria in the basement. And we would sit around a round table, and what we would talk about at lunch was the relevance of social psychology to whatever was in the New York Times that day. And it was just a kick, and ideas were fun and people had great, times with them. And so I realized that Mort got this from Lewin, that the idea that you constantly apply, ideas and principles to what's going on in the world came from Lewin and was very active in his students. Okay, so that was wonderful. And so in 1998, I think it was, I was in the intern program at Bethel. There were 3 women and 17 men. And they were, it was a 9-week program, if you can believe it. So training and all kinds of people came through, et cetera, et cetera. And that was where I got to met Edie and got to know her well, and got to meet Billy and got to know her. And we started having conversations about NTL. Why weren't more women on the training staffs? And what happened was that we asked those questions of the folks in Washington at the headquarters. And they said, okay, they said, make a list. So we made a list, 20 women that we knew could be very competent T group trainers. And the next summer, none of them had shown up on staffs during the year. And we said to them, what happened? We gave you this list. What list? They said, we didn't know there was a list. They lost the list. So we made another list and we gave it to them. And that time it took. And so there began to be more women of color, white women, Hispanic women. I mean, we knew there were a lot of people out there who could do training, and they were not being invited. And that got us into the business, which I won't spend much time on, of Hal Kellner and Edie and Peter Vale and I, the so-called 4 horse persons, being invited in when NTL was in a huge crisis in the early 70s. We were invited in to take a look at the organization and to see if we could help. And we all went in like any kind of consulting thing, and we interviewed people, and then we got together and we said, this is a disaster. The organization was $250,000 in debt, and the board was about to sell or declare bankruptcy and go out of business. That was the point at which we decided that we could feed, and that was Peter Vale, I think, who had this brilliant idea that that maybe we could save the organization. So we made a proposal to the board that we would, in fact, take over the organization, and we would bail them out, basically. And I can talk more about that later if there's interest. But what we did was, that was the beginning of the new NTL. And Edie was the first president. Elsie Cross was the first chairman of the board. I was the second chairman of the board, et cetera, et cetera. But those were very complicated days because white people couldn't talk very clearly. Edie was clearer than anybody with black people about what was going on. And there were factions on the board where people were talking to each other outside the board, but we couldn't get it on the table, even though we were, in fact, really wanting to have an organization that functioned as an inclusive society. So anyway, all of that happened. I gave about 10 years of my life, almost close to full time, to the organization at that point. Then I decided, if I'm going to stay in the university, I got to get serious. In other words, I had just done just enough to get tenure, but I knew that I couldn't survive well if I didn't really join my situation. So at UB, I started a training program, and we were part of the graduate student group that came to Bethel for a number of years. We ran a program, and we had a marvelous time at the university. So while I was doing all of that, Billy and I stayed connected, and we were both teaching in the Columbia certificate program, which was a program that was 3 weeks spread out across the year in OD we called it the Parade of Stars. All kinds of people came in and gave talks, and we were the glue, so to speak, the people that they talked to after the others went home, basically. And it was fun because we could, schmooze with each other all the time about what was happening in our own lives and our practice. And it was a wonderful group of people who went through these programs. Anyway, what happened was, Billy and I are sitting there talking. This is late 70s, no, late 80s. And Billy says, Barbara, she says, there's something weird going on outside. And we'd been through all of the stuff about all the tensions that had gone through NTL about the encounter movement and all kinds of other things. And we were interested in kind of the big picture of what was happening to consulting, because, from team building in the 70s and 80s, things were changing and there were people doing interesting new things. And so we began to talk about, Kathy Danamiller, can you believe this? She had 500 people in a room for a whole week. And she was the only trainer there, I think. Was that right? I mean, how would you do that, basically? And then we heard about this character in the Episcopal Church out of that tradition that I already mentioned, Harrison Owen. Harrison Owen is doing this strange stuff. It's a meeting without an agenda. I think he's what's he calling it? Calling it open space. What's that? I mean, that's not one of our concepts, right? And then what else is happening? Well, and we began to sort of say to each other, is it possible that something really new is bubbling up? And then we remembered our history. What we remembered was that at the same time that the Tea Group was invented, Tavistock Institute developed in London. And there was all this stuff going on in the UK at the same time. These people were not, as far as I know, connected, although Jean can correct me if I'm wrong about that. And so we started thinking, maybe there's bubble up here that's happening. Wow, wouldn't that be great, basically? How do we find out? And we just looked at each other, and there was a long silence. And then there was a longer silence. And then I just suddenly remembered something. And it was that Clay Aldifer had called me about a month or two before at the university, and he'd said, Barbara, he'd said, we need a special issue for jabs. Is there any possibility that you would have a title that you could propose? Are you thinking about anything that would make a special issue? And I said, I haven't a thing in my mind, Clay, but I'd be glad to turn it over. And he said, that would be good. He was obviously calling a number of people. And that popped into my head. I said, Billy, I said, I think I know how we find out if this is really happening out there or if it isn't. I said, suppose we set out a proposal for a special issue of jabs and we call it large group interventions or whatever. I think that was the first term we used. And suppose we send this out to people and see what we get. And if it's really happening out there, there's going to be stuff that we don't know about. And she loved the idea. And so I went to Clay and I said, Clay, we have an idea, but it's very tenuous. And what will happen if we get four articles that we can publish and nothing else? I said, that would be a disaster. I mean, it would, if we announce that we're going to do large group stuff. He said, Barbara, he said, don't worry about it. He said, on my desk, I have this big pile of small group manuscripts already approved. He said, you fill from the beginning, from the front. I will fill from the back if you run out. Do you know that the 1992, I think it was, jabs, the first one that we did that came out, was full of large group interventions. In other words, we did not need to use any of his small group stuff. We found out stuff was going on that we had no idea was going on, basically, and that was the beginning. And then, as many of you know from your own histories, the next thing that we did was we thought, well, this is really something, how do we talk about this? And so what we did was we proposed a session or two at the OD Network, which in those days was an organization where if anything was bubbling up, you could find out about what was happening. So we went to that session and we had two concerns. One concern was Billy and I looked at each other and we said, have you ever been in any workshop or session where two women run it? No. Are they going to accept this? I mean, we have to realize that we came out of the history of, I used to take a graduate male student in with me to clients that I was interviewing or trying to get a contract with. And the client would always talk to the male student, not to me, the professor. Those were the days when women were not expected to carry the main role, basically. And so to have two women up there, we didn't know whether this would be acceptable at the ODN. And we were very flaky about it. And so the first time we did something like that, we were waiting to see what happened. And at the end of the session, about a third of the women in the room came running to the front and said, this is the most wonderful thing that's ever happened. To see two of you up there talking and running this meeting so competently just made us almost weep, basically. So that was very reinforcing, but it was scary, basically. The other thing we had to figure out was, okay, there are now, at that point, maybe 8, maybe 10 sort of new methods bubbling up that people are using. And we thought, we are not the inventors of these methods. We are the systematizers. I mean, we're structuring this. We're trying to help people understand what's happening. Okay. So we're going to go in there and we're going to say, this is what open space is. And, Harrison sometimes comes to these meetings. And then the conference model, Dick and Emily Axelrod are going to be there. And, and we're going to talk about their model. What are we going to do? Are we going to check it out with them ahead of time? uh, we were very concerned that we represent adequately, but from our point of view, what was happening. Okay, so what we decided to do was we invited all of them to come. And when we finished presenting each of the models, one of us would turn to whoever the instigator, the originator was, and say, okay, Dick, did we get that right? You want to say anything? Would you want to add to it in any way? And so we engaged them. Well, what did that mean? A very interesting thing happened. They got to know each other. These people who were potential competitors for clients in the large group scale got to know each other and were trading off ideas and things like that. They were still sometimes in situations where they were bidding against each other for clients, but they also got personal relationships with each other. And then Billy, over the next 4 or 5 years in the 90s, Billy and I did workshops ourselves to help people understand what the options were. And we also ran a conference for 4 years that Tom Chase ran, where all the presenters came, all the originators came. We ran the conference. They brought clients, they brought students, they brought their own staff, basically. And it usually ran about 200 people. And it was a wonderful engagement of people who are doing this work, talking to each other, sharing ideas. And it's not to say that there was no competition, but it was enough collaboration that it became something that was really, I think, very exciting. And I think it's an interesting model. And there are some other, when you think about the competition, for example, in at the personal level in consulting and stuff, like in coaching, or some in the 80s, there was some of the differences in diversity consulting. People were very different from each other and hostile about what other people were doing. And I think there was less of that in the large group stuff, maybe because of all of this. But at any rate, that's what I wanted to say about. So anyway, we did a book in 92. We did a book, another book in 96. The 2006 book that we did is really cases. There's one chapter that talks about all the methods. And then it's, how does this stuff work in this situation? How does it work in that situation? With cases, basically. So it's fun. Now, I had a diagram that I wanted to show just as a way of kind of pulling this together. Is it possible to get that up?
Let me see, Barbara. I think it should be.
Give us a moment.
Oh,
Yeah, Nelda.
the voice. Yes, the voice of the expert. Thank heavens for Nelda. This might be a good time for all of us to think about if there's a question that's on your mind for either Pat or Barbara to decide, because we will, as soon as Barbara finishes, we'll be opening the floor for a brief period, but a focus period for questions that you might want to direct to either.
About what, 5 minutes more or something like that?
Oh yeah, you've got 5 more minutes, Barbara. There's no rush. I just wanted to, while people were sort of waiting for your diagram.
Hi everyone, it's Deej. I apologize. It's coming up now.
Here we go. Oh, there it is.
Okay, can you see the whole thing? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Now, this is what Charlie Seashore, in one of his wonderful metaphors, would call, in my view, a blinding flash of the obvious. Okay. It's something you all know. It's very, straightforward. It's about levels of intervention. And essentially, when NTL started, and that's why I did all this history, we were mostly at the group level, okay? Some intergroup exercises, but not too many initially, basically. And I think that two interesting things have happened. One is that the coaching, the coaching and HR stuff has really developed in the 90s and 2000s, basically, in a very interesting way. But it's that's the individual level for the most part. And then the large group interventions were the first iteration, and I think other people have taken this further. The first intervention of saying, hey, we're missing something here. We are missing the level of the way to bring the whole system together about issues that affect the whole system. And so that's just a piece of what's in my head all the time. I'm always thinking about kind of, is there are we missing something at some level as I'm thinking about clients and that sort of stuff. And the large group intervention thing was, for me, a way of sort of finishing the diagram, which is not to say that, of course, the world outside is very, very important. But in terms of the work that I was involved in, these were the sort of levels at which I thought, basically. And for example, Jean Newman's talk this morning was wonderful. I was so focused on the group that I didn't really know much about intergroup for a while. And some of the TAVI stuff has helped me to understand groups from a different perspective, so that it's been very, very helpful. And so we don't live in a very simple world, and it helps me to have something that's sort of conceptual that I can hang on to, basically, in order to understand what's going on. So that's my story, basically. I leave you with that little thought, and let's turn to questions or whatever anybody wants to talk about.
Good. That's terrific. Thank you so much, Barbara, and obviously Pat as well. We haven't had a chance to give you dual rounds of applause, but now it's a chance. If you have had questions that have bubbled up for either Pat or Barbara, or for both of them, now would be a time to frame those. And then if you'd raise your paw in the box, then Nelda will put you in queue, and we can make sure that we get to as many questions before the end of session, which will be on the half hour, as possible. So we're going to start, I guess, with Dave. And we'll have, we go.
Thank you, Barbara. It was a delight to hear not only the story, but how you told it. Your animation and your enthusiasm was wonderful. And I'm involved in this right now because I am, I've just finished the book that Peter Vail started, his last book. It's called Practice as a Way of Being. And I've also we started a podcast together until he passed away. And I think Peter would be delighted about many of the things you said, but particularly, I think he was very proud of how he helped NTL at some of those critical moments. So congratulations for saving us and getting us to the 75th on behalf of Peter Vail.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, Sukari, you're on.
Okay, I want to thank both Barbara and Pat for bringing Kathy Dannemiller's name into the room. Kathy did a lot of her whole-scale change work with American labor unions. At the time, that is how I came to know Kathy and to study with Kathy. The union I worked for at the time did a lot of work using the whole-scale methodology. And I know that, we've talked about a lot of other contributors, and, everybody's a contributor, I guess, ultimately, but Kathy's name doesn't come up very much in these kinds of conversations. And the work that she did with 500 people in the room, the union I worked with, we had 1,300 people in the room doing a whole-scale change initiative that wound up helping the union reinvent itself and to do really great work into the future. So thank you very much. I was very happy when Pat, brought Kathy's name into the room, and then you again, Barbara. Thanks again.
Thanks, Sakari. Helen, I think you're next.
Dave, could I tell a Kathy story?
Barbara, yeah, do you mind, Helen, while Barbara tells a Kathy story? Thanks, of course,
Kathy
Barbara.
Kathy was not only a union, she's a daughter of a union member, and she was a piece of work, as we used to say. She was wonderful. And one of the things I did when I was doing the large group stuff was to go observe 2 or 3 of her big interventions. And I was in the Revere Pots and Pans thing out in Ohio at some point for 3 days. And there was one point at which people were screaming at each other on the floor, and I was terrified. And I went up to Kathy. I said, "Is this really okay, Kathy?" And she said, "Barbara," she said, "they need to get this out of their system. It'll be just fine," basically. She had this great sense of dynamics. She understood what people needed to do. And, I was out in the hall for the breaks and a little bit later. And while these people that were still screaming, and there were people out in the hall saying, "Those people, they always do that. They'll get through it," basically. So, I mean, there was this just wonderful sort of swirl of affect and stuff that she didn't get terrified by it. And it was a little scary to me. But she just took it in stride and rolled with the punches and did whatever she needed to do next. She was a marvelous consultant. Yeah.
Thanks. Helen,
thank you, Peter. Thank you, Pat and Barbara. That was really, really interesting as you painted the history for us. 2 things stuck out for me yesterday when Edgar Schein said, "America is committing itself to a slow death." And I think it was Dr. Greer who said that we sometimes at NTL think of ourselves as a Ritz-Carlton when maybe we're the Howard Johnsons at best. And these 2 comments are sitting with me still, and connecting it, connecting it to Pat, what you talked about. I looked for both the books. I could only get Larry Lippett's book on preferred futuring, but I'm interested. I want to ask the question to both of you. Is Barbara, when I heard you describe the state of the board being dysfunctional in the 70s and the fact that we almost went bankrupt, and the hairs on my arm stand on end as I realize that we've been living that reality today, that history repeats itself when we don't learn the lessons of the past. We certainly living, not with the bankruptcy, but we did recently. And so I asked myself, what would it take? And I'm asking both of you, from a large scale systems intervention, from preferred futuring, to think about with me, what would it take for us to move NTL into a place where we stop all the infighting, the dysfunction at whatever level it's at, looking at navel gazing, and to actually create some, if you like, Kathy Lippert and I were talking yesterday, roundtables that have very large systems, societal concerns like climate change, democracy, gun control. We can pick them. And that we offer something not revenue generating, but we offer something back to the world and to America that's committed to slow death, given all of the skills and talent that we have. I know that's a long way of asking you a question, but I actually, at the core of my heart, believe that NTL is the Ritz-Carlton, but we seem to have forgotten how to rise to that occasion.
Barbara, Pat?
Over to you, Pat.
First of all, in the spirit of Kathy Danner-Miller, Ron Lippett, or myself, wonderful screaming and yelling from participants to each other when they are engaged in a common pursuit is great. However, when uncontrolled, name calling, disputing, sending out information without a common cause and no central principle about what is the vision that we have that we want to go forward really is very dysfunctional. And I don't think we have a common vision right now within NTL for your question. And I don't think people are engaging with each other in subgroups that are different. So how do we get the whole principles we know how to do, having people with different perspectives engage with each other? So that's more what you're talking about, the internal, the board with itself, the board with the members. I think we do need to do more free engagements in some of the ways you're talking, and they could make a contribution.
Barbara, you have any thoughts?
I think that she said it very well, basically.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Any other questions for Pat or Barbara? Oh, go ahead, Janet. I see your hand. Janet, you have to, yeah, they'll have to unmute you. Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Hopefully that'll happen. There you go.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
I don't know how to raise my hand on here. Anyway, I'm curious by the levels of intervention, Blinding Flash of Obvious by Charlie Seashore. But today I have noticed that there's just coaching. There's a health coach. There's a spiritual coach. So it's on the triangle, there's all this coaching going on, at least in North America and Europe. It's very, seems to be overwhelming to become a coach or to be coached. And how does that fit into sort of where we are as a society today and in the, organizational and conversations between groups?
I can take a shot at that.
Take a shot? Great, thanks.
I think we're a fadistic society in America, much more than Europe is. And so we're always looking for the hot new thing. And one of the things that happened in the 90s was that clinical psychologists were looking for new stuff to do. And some of my graduate students in clinical psychology, one of them was one of the first books on coaching. And it wasn't necessarily OD people who did it, but they discovered the organizational life partly through social psychology, which came in to the university in the 70s and 80s. And they, many of them decided that rather than seeing 10 people a day individually or in groups, that they could maybe do something different. They could be in systems which are actually more interesting in some ways. That's me talking, not them. And so I think the coaching thing has become it was the latest fad. I don't know what the latest fad is because I'm no longer in that sort of arena. But I remember when June Delano, who was at Kodak, told me that she had to go break up and fire a whole bunch of coaches in one of the units of Kodak because it had become incestuous. That is, everybody wanted to have their coach. And they all got different ones, and they were competing with each other about who had the best coach instead of doing the work they needed to do. And, she went over and fired them all. She was the head of HR and a very good consultant. And so there is this fadistic thing that happens in the United States that people have to make a living. So they sell, where I live in Buffalo, there are a lot of people doing consulting who are selling products rather than really what I'd call selling consulting. They have a solution that they can do with you, kind of thing. And we have a lot of that in the US.
Thanks. Shanae, I think you're next.
Thank you. I really hesitated to ask this question because it's very simple and concrete, and all three presentations from Pat, Jean, and Barbara have been so rich and thought-provoking. But This is mostly for Pat. I had always thought of NTL and T groups as originating in Bethel, and you mentioned Connecticut, and I was wondering if you had any specifics. And it touched me personally because I live in Connecticut, and I actually, just really wondered where exactly in Connecticut this took place, because I've always connected the origins with Bethel.
I'm hunting for the details. Maybe Marianne Rainey, she's an introvert like me, but she gave a very beautiful explanation about the Connecticut work. If you'd like to give it now, I'm hunting for the description I have, but I don't see it.
But Pat, it's okay, Pat. My mentor, Mort Deutsch, was one of the observers of that first event. And it did happen in Connecticut. And he used to tell stories about it, and the story he told was about the fact that the observers would have meetings at night to share that they were doing research on groups. This was before NTL, and they would share their data. And one night there was this knock on the door, and some of the participants were outside, and they said, "We hear you're talking about us and our groups. We want to come in and hear what you're saying." And Lewin, who was a very open guy, my mentor, Mort, said, we all sort of died, when we heard that. We thought that would be a terrible idea. Mort said, "Come on in." Lewin said, "Come on in." And so they sat around the outside circle and they watched and what the reporters had to say and what they made of the groups. And then when they were finished, Lewin turned to the outside circle and he said, "And what are you thinking out there?" And they had a chance to then say what they thought had happened in the group. And the dialogue that happened between the observers, the researchers, and the participants who came was so exciting that soon became the core meeting of the workshop, which went on for 2 weeks. Everybody looked forward to it.
The fact I wanted to look up was that the reason this workshop was held in 47 was that Lewin himself went to Connecticut several times to deal with different groups on issues that they were inviting him on racism and anti-Semitism. So he really had built up a connection to the participants before the workshop. And I don't remember those exact dates. That's what I was going to look up. But
Thanks.
Well, I have something to say. Hi, everyone. We're coming close to our meal break. And first of all, Pat and Barbara, thank you very much. Barbara, I've heard you speak before, and I too love Kathy Dana Miller. I used to trot behind her, and she always had on her sneakers. And as I get to those ages where trotting becomes a little bit more of a challenge, I find myself channeling Kathy Dana Miller and my sneakers. But that's the personal side of this. One of the things that I am so excited and appreciative about is, we've said this a couple of times, so I just want to say it again. One of the things that's a gift to the community as part of the 75th is a wonderful video that the 75th committee has co-produced. And the opening of the production is some of the pictures from the Connecticut meeting, as well as conversations about Kurt Lewin and those early experiments. So we put a little animation to it, not really animation, it's a video, so we put some movement to it. But as you see it opening, you'll see those, conversations and information about the 1947 conference in Connecticut. I think it was in Bridgeport, Connecticut, but I don't.
I think that sounds right.
Marianne is raising her hand. And can we unmute Marianne quickly, please?
We have that data as a present to the community, and I'm asking
there we go.
Kathy and Dave and the board and the membership of NTL that we are able to use that video for millennials and Gen X's and all of us who are also visual learners as a gift. And so you'll see yourselves in it, not all of us, but some of us, but you'll definitely see that early history in some very creative ways. So Barbara Bunker, you put us in today and it's in the video, and we are going to keep going with that. And I'm really appreciative of everything both you wonderful women have said. And I've already sent a message to Jean. Thank you so much. Oops, and we're over. I'm sorry, Peter.
No, that's fine. Marianne, did you have one quick
New
comment?
Britain, Connecticut, and Kathy, you're right, because Bridgeport was integral in that, because that's where at the University of Bridgeport is where I got my first T group training, but it was in New Britain, Connecticut.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for your kind attention at these wonderful, wonderful presentations. As Kathy said, we're unbelievably grateful for the generosity that Pat and Barbara have shared with us, and along with Jean earlier in the day. So have a great lunch. We're